Karis, you believe me? I didn't expect that. Karis stopped in her rocking motion to regard the policeman beside her. He looked weary. Handsome once, she supposed. Like her dad, he seemed to have witnessed too much of the dark side of life to not let it show. Being taken seriously by anyone was a pleasant change. Even Evie had acted as though she'd left the mental ward too soon. There was nothing wrong with her. She hadn't suffered her mother's bipolar disorder or her borderline disorder, and now she wasn't convinced her mom had either. The close encounters of the fourth kind she'd experienced her whole life. Her mother suffered in hers too. If someone can convince you that real, tangible things you know you've seen are nightmares or hallucinations, then it's no surprise if you begin to see things that really aren't there. Anxiety and exhaustion can cause anyone to have visions. Post-traumatic stress will lead the sanest soldier to relive their terror-filled moments in graphic realism. It created a circle of confusion where the real things become less and less convincing. But that didn't make them mentally ill, merely gaslighting their own brain. That was why, with support, she had been off antidepressants and antipsychotic medication for a while. Free from the fog the meds used to encase her head, Karis was able to concentrate enough to read again. A passion that an unquiet mind denied. Her for years was now her chief escape. Cooped up in the ward when the news of the pandemic broke didn't seem such a terrible place to be. Depression played its part in managing her expectations. There seemed little point in anything much. But books were different. Control belonged entirely to the author. She didn't even get to choose the titles. She devoured what she was given. And that was that. So she knew the creatures in the wall were real. No one wanted it to be a symptom of psychosis more than she, but they couldn't be denied. "Why?" she asked at last. "Why? Why do I believe you?" Karis nodded. It would be nice to make her feel good by confirming she struck him as trustworthy. She did, despite having the darting eyes of a lunatic. But it was the appearance of his recent enemy-come-ally from Austin, Texas, FBI agent Nathan Dale, that convinced him. Everything was plausible with him around. Having already experienced sights he never would have imagined with his new frenemy, walls coming to life and trying to kill you hardly seemed more outlandish. "An ex-colleague of mine from America is here and talking to your son." "Aid? Eve?" "I didn't quite register the name," he told me. "Ebe, extra-biological entity. His dad's an ET." She unknowingly echoed Nathan's words and stared, waiting for the police sergeant to tell her that he didn't trust her after all. That on second thoughts, he would have to accept her testimony with the skepticism the ramblings of the mentally unhinged warranted. But he didn't. "Nathan told me. How did that work?" Karis held her breath. This was the first person who had ever shown he understood her. Her husband had, but kept it hidden for his own unearthly agenda. This stranger was showing her more understanding than anyone ever in her life. Tears trickled down her cheeks as she answered. "They made me believe I was raped by this boy I went on a date with. But it was them. And then Ebe came along. I loved him from the first moment I knew of his existence. You can see how I ended up in St. Caradogs, can't you? I don't even blame them. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't believe me either." She choked. "But I'm ever so grateful that you do." Rex sighed. What was the world coming to? Were the creatures limited to the West Angle Bay Hotel in Wales? It seemed unlikely, especially with the FBI interested. There must be more. There had to be. He exhaled again. "You're welcome, Mrs. Ellis. I'm just worried about what it means." "Call me Karis. Whatever it means, I doubt there's much we can do about it. There never has been before." Rex nodded. They might have been the wisest words. Born from dreadful experiences. But that didn't make them any less disturbing. Ben. It seemed a waste of time. Coursework called, but Ben was too far behind to find the will to start. The pivotal moment had passed a few weeks ago, the moment when there existed a chance he'd catch up and complete his history of art degree. If he didn't manage the first year, He could repeat the lectures next year. It was a built-in buffer for students who struggled. The university got paid again, so it made sense for them to make it available. He'd end up with more student debt, but the idea he would ever earn enough money to even begin paying it back was laughable. Resigned to repeating the year, any interest he'd experienced now shelved in favor of a life of leisure while he still could. He excused in deference to the cold truth that one day he'd need to grow up, take it seriously, and get a high job. If he was honest, the leisure disappointed. It seemed as though he was the only one who had struggled. And so, his circle of friends, numerous and promising at Freshers, had dwindled. Many had decided it was too hard, even with the prospect of taking it again. Living away from home had not been what they'd expected. Overwhelmed and with a sense of failure that their families would struggle to rebuild in a timely manner, they had ventured back home. That left the thrivers, the society-belonging, lecture-loving workaholics who embarked to the pub to complete a shift of bar work to make money rather than piss their student grant up the wall. Literally, if the public toilets were closed. Swansea City Council had even given up trying to stop them and had recently opted instead to place temporary open-air urinals in the middle of the street. It was disgusting when he thought about it. Penniless and friendless, and with no work worth his attention right now, he turned to the other famous student pastime, smoking pot. He'd never smoked anything before, but was now an expert in rolling joints and making bongs out of empty Red Bull cans. Or, realistically, the cheaper store-brand alternatives. As he stared at the mildewed wall of his musty bedroom in the empty house, he was glad he'd not used all his stash. He'd taken to buying £100 worth at a time because 20 here and there soon added up, and he got a lot more for his money if he bought in bulk. If he didn't know better, he'd think what he saw was a direct result of a bad trip. But his little tin remained full, and there was no high to go along with this hallucination. He'd seen the little face in the pattern of mold for weeks, drifted off to sleep, talking to it when he was drunk enough. Something seemed definitely off about it today, though. He sniffed the tin. The reassuring fruity smell filled his nostrils, and he removed a pinch. Friends, when he'd had them, mixed it with other things to make it last, but that had never satisfied Ben. Along with the plant matter, Ben's tin contained papers, a lighter, and a little grinder. Soon, he'd expertly packed a rectangle of white paper with a generous amount of product and rolled it. So full it resembled a taco as he forced it closed and hoped his spittle would be sufficiently gluey. He never even lit it before weirdness made him shake his head. "The fucking face is moving, I'd swear to it," he said out loud, in the hope it would make it not real. Like bringing himself to return to reality would force his imagination back on the program. Every hair on Ben's body rose to the threat. Chill bulged his eyes, and his jaw fell open as he struggled to comprehend the horror unfolding. What had been a pattern? A smudge on the wall, which his paranoid imagination invented into humanoid features, sprung forward and hung in the air. A monstrous face from another dimension. He gulped, frozen, as hollow, sunken eyes peered. As it saw him, the face bulged further from the confines of the painted surface, freeing lifeless features into unmistakable realism. 2 eyes, a mouth, carved from granite and hollow as the deepest cavern. The mouth opened wide, and the thing wailed into the room. Trembling limbs refused to move, but Ben's eyes shifted from the terrifying face just for a moment, just long enough to detect protrusions joining the atrocity in his room. Arms, legs, a torso. It was enough to fight the yai. Inertia. Ben jumped up. Finely ground marijuana dusting the air, he tore for the door. Strewn clothes failed in their stab at tripping him, but succeeded in diverting the small toe on his left foot to collide forcefully with the corner of his bedpost. Crying in pain, he couldn't let it slow him down, and as he yanked the door open, he jumped free of the room. Even though a glance back seemed to reveal the wall restored to normal, Ben didn't pause. He ran down the stairs, scrabbled open the latch of the front door, and fell onto the street. With no shoes, he scampered forward and ran with no idea where he was going, but he wasn't about to stop. As terror slackened its dominion, the pain of running downtown hill with no protection for his bare feet began to register. He'd seen nothing as he left the house, and no one on the street was reacting as though monsters were chasing him. Distance gave a fresh perspective. What was he even doing? He stopped, palms on thighs, great gulps of breath filling his lungs between gasps. He needed a break from the old wacky-backy, didn't he? He ducked into a cafe. "I'm sorry. You can't come in here with no shoes." It was a way to keep the homeless out, Ben supposed. It wasn't his usual thing, to leave without a fight, but of course he hadn't picked up his wallet in his rush. If he had, whether funds would be sufficient for cafe-priced coffee was debatable. So, what? Go back to the house? To the rolled-up spliff he had abandoned? It didn't seem sensible, but he couldn't go far not wearing footwear. The thought of grabbing some from Shoe Zone's outside baskets sparked in his mind and extinguished just as fast. Shoplifting wasn't completely alien to him. He'd liberated a lot of things in his time, but it had been in a group with a substance or two egging him on. Stone-cold sober, he could see how stupid it was. As it stood, he still had the option to begin his degree next year. A criminal record would spoil all that. Although another term would offer an opportunity to excuse his lethargy towards lectures, he wasn't totally sure he would take the university up on their kind insurance policy in favor of giving up and getting any old job. On balance, if it was too tough for him now, next year would be no different. But he wasn't ready to give up on it just yet. What would history of art get him anyway? He couldn't muse on that now. He still didn't know where he was going. Monsters climbing. From the wall, it had to have been his imagination. It wouldn't be the first time he had hallucinated, the first time without something to bring it on, perhaps. Really, it had to be that he was more tired than he realized. That was all. With a shudder, the memory of what he'd seen shook him. Come on. It wasn't real. He clenched and unclenched his fists, arms stiffly at his sides. Able to push fear down to make the first steps, the exertion of taking the long, steep hill squeezed it aside even further, until confronted again with the front door to the little terraced house he shared. What was the time? He didn't know. The town had been busy, so not early, which would have been a miracle. He hadn't left his bed before lunchtime for months. Estimation of 4 or 5. Definitely after 3, he was sure. No, waiting for one of the others to come back wasn't outrageous. If he could look nonchalant and relaxed, just getting a bit of fresh air, he wouldn't even look like a nutcase. Ben sat on the wall at the front of the house, which separated it from the footpath. Hunger gnarled in his stomach. If he had his wallet, he'd stroll to the corner shop. The hot burgers were lush and less than 2 pounds. They knew their clientele. Feet taking his weight again, he stood, turned briefly to go up the path and back inside, just to get his money. He wouldn't be in for more than a minute. 30 seconds was more like it. With a forced sigh, he slumped again. For F's sake. He pressed his thumbnail into his palm until it hurt. Punishment for being such an absolute wuss. He stood, marched to the front door, threw it open hard enough to bang on the wall so any monsters would know not to mess with him. Stairs. Taken 2 at a time, he kicked his door and winced, ready to run again. It couldn't have looked more normal. Shoulders sagging, he stepped slowly and deliberately to the shabby chest of drawers, the top of which he kept his wallet, his keys, textbooks, clean pants, and a cactus. Surely dead after a year of no water, but still had a green hue suggesting revival was a possibility. It never would, though, because no matter how many times Ben stared at it from across the room, the knotted guilt that a minute of his time would make the world of difference to the little plant, squeezing in his chest. Every occasion he was close enough to actually help it, he had something else to do. Wallet open to check the contents, he slid it into his pocket and promised the fuzzy plant he might water it later if he remembered. Before he left the room, he thought to pick up his keys. Leaving it on the latch was only supposed to be if one of them was in the house. He didn't feel too guilty for taking off in his panic. If a burglar had chanced it and tried the door to see if it was unlocked, he or she wouldn't get very far before they'd turn around again, probably with a hand over their nose and mouth. Apart from the unsanitary state of the place, there was nothing to take. Laptops and phones were valuable, of course, but never left in the house, always being stared at or stowed briefly in rucksacks. Ben had his keys now anyway, so there was no risk of passive-aggressive exasperations from the others. A glance back at the wall. The face lingered as clear as ever. The pattern of fungus made 2 eyes, a gaping mouth, and a triangular nose. Thankfully, it was still and lifeless, mold and nothing more. He couldn't unsee it. His mind honed to recognize instantly, but he could remove it. Instead of a burger, he should buy a mold remover spray. Opening his wallet again, he nodded with a smile. It looked possible he might afford both. The smile lingering, Ben stepped into the cramped convenience store at the end of his road. The hot food counter depleted. Clearly everyone else had bought and eaten. Only 2 other people were in the shop, a man in a tweed jacket and flat cap, and a lady about his mum's age wearing a red flowery dress. They didn't seem like competition for the dregs of the snacks, but Ben picked up a burger-shaped wrapper that turned out to be a sausage and cheese roll. He shrugged. Not what he wanted, but reduced in price due to the lateness of morning. Held loosely so as not to ruin it, Ben squinted as he went off to find an aisle never before visited as he searched for anti-mold spray. He had enough cash, and grabbed a milkshake too, just in case the sausages were horrible. A small park set to one side of a patch of scrubby grass, covered in graffiti and smelling of urine. Teenager or dog or both wasn't the obvious choice for a picnic, but it benefited from a bench at least. It was not due to fear of the wall in his room, of course it wasn't. If he preferred his sausage and cheese baps hot, that didn't mean he was afraid. Despite residing in a house whose hygiene rating would be into the minuses if ever it were to be tested, the offensive odor of the little playground spoiled his satisfaction in the warm sausages, stodgy bread, and almost melted cheese. He'd paid for it, so he would eat it. The milkshake proved a godsend that helped to wash the taste away. A sudden urgency from his bowels defeated reluctance to venture back to the house. His thoughts were dominated by the tang of sausage that combined with the cramps in his belly to persuade him that perhaps a warm cupboard wasn't the best place to keep food fresh. Clenched buttocks prevailed against potential calamity as he hobbled along, reaching his door in time to fumble his key into the lock and scurry up the stairs to the shared bathroom. Thank God no one else was home to take his place. He'd have had to have thrown them out GTA style. Exiting the toilet, at last the sounds of other housemates echoed around the building. Stomach clutched in his arms, Ben lay on the bed. He didn't have the capability to deal with the mold right now. No matter how he turned his head, his eyes were drawn to the face pattern. With a shrug, he rotated to the wall abutting his bed. But that felt terribly vulnerable. On his back, he faced the ceiling instead. Mold spores hadn't reached their way there yet, but stippled Artex quickly formed pictures in his mind, so he forced his eyelids closed before they settled on a face again. Why? What did he think would happen? If monsters lived in his walls, would they only attack him if he looked at them? What was he, 5? Perhaps he should call his dad to check under the bed or in his wardrobe. Determined to forget about it, and feeling foolish, he kept his eyes shut for the minutes in between urgent trips to the bathroom. After 3 visits in half an hour, he decided to stay put until it passed. Arthur.Ebe hovered in the doorway. From the couch next to his mother, Sergeant Rex Austin looked up, but meeting his eye was impossible. He watched as the large, odd man half-stepped into the room, then stepped back, hidden behind the door again. Aren't you going to talk to your mama? Rex heard the big Texan's voice from beyond. Ebe didn't move closer as a result, and instead disappeared further from view. "Ebe!" Karis called out, her gaze staring at nothing on the floor. "What is it you want to tell me, son?" Ebe shuffled in. I have to go back to Alaska." He rolled his eyes. A signal he'd learned meant something he hoped was appropriate to the situation in appeasing his mum. Would she have to return to the ward if he wasn't there to look after her? The consequence didn't seem to have registered in Karis. "You've only just got here." The loss of her only child, the only thing she cared about. "I could come with you." Nathan tapped Ebe's arm, which made him pull it away in disgust, but he saw the big American shake his head. "Security clearance won't allow it." "But she's my mum." "Who has just been released from a secure mental health unit?" "I don't want to go to Alaska. My ex-husband tried to persuade me there for years, but this is my home." Memories of her son growing up were all here in Wales, but if she went to Alaska, they could make more. She should stop living in the past. "I'm pleased to hear that," Nathan boomed. "Without clearance from your doctors and our security services, I wouldn't be able to allow it anyway. Not in time. You see, I need to take Ebe with me. Right away. It's a matter of international importance." Slowly, Karis nodded. Her mind had already rejected the will to fight it. She'd fought for years and got nowhere. Books and a window. Her solace for months, and it had been the most peaceful she had ever felt. "Before we leave, Ebe tells me you saw something in your room this morning. I'd like you to tell me about it, if you wouldn't mind." "I'm guessing. That's why you're here, Rex? The staff seem jittery, so I'm speculating it's legit?" "To be honest, when I saw you, I assumed you already knew, and that was why you were here." "Indirectly." Nathan didn't elaborate. "So, tell me." Karis answered, still staring at the floor. "Tell me, Karis, what did you see?" She described her morning, and for the second time in as many minutes, she was believed. The floor lost its appeal, and she looked straight into the face of the big man. "It's something to do with Ebe, isn't it? What he was doing in Alaska." Nathan laughed. "I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you." He chuckled more. Rex tried to catch her eye. "This weirdo is deadly serious," he struggled to convey, but she hadn't taken her eyes from Nathan. She was nodding along like she understood. He didn't know what she'd been through, but from her face, it seemed like a lot. "When will you be back?" Ebe looked at Nathan. "We can't say, ma'am. A few things our superiors are concerned about that Ebe can help with. Hopefully, it won't take long." "I'll be back in a few days, I'm sure, Mum. And there's—" He stopped himself telling her about Molly. It was too much to expect her to be thrilled about her when she had spent less than 24 hours with him. He didn't excuse not finishing his sentence. No one seemed to care. "You never know," Nathan lied about the possibility of a prompt return. "Right now, we need to be on our way, so if you'd like to say your goodbyes, we'll make a move." Rex stood instinctively to let Ebe sit next to his mother. The big, awkward, bulbous-headed boy swooped in for a cuddle and clung on with an affection that surprised Rex. He felt emotion, then. As he gripped her in his big arms, head rested on her chest, he dwarfed her, and, despite the obvious struggle for breath, she held him just as tight. "Come on, it's time to go," Nathan urged. Twice more he made similar commands, and on the fourth, Ebe pulled back and stood up. His large eyes crinkled with grief as he stepped from his mum. As he reached the door, his chest felt heavy as the uncontained sob breached her mouth. He didn't look back. He couldn't. With Nathan, he marched from the hotel and out to a large, black vehicle. The driver hopped from behind the wheel and opened the door. As Ebe ducked into the rear seat, he saw the passenger was armed with a small rifle. He'd chosen to leave and to do his duty to the military, the government, or the Aryans, whoever was calling the shots, but he'd had no choice. As the jeep trundled along the narrow country lanes, the Atlantic Ocean glistening on either side of the peninsular, eBay found his voice. "You believe my mother, then? About creatures crawling out of the walls? She is mentally unstable, you know." Nathan grunted and stared out of the window. The day room at Brookmead's nursing home was full, so Arthur struggled with his 4-footed cane to the outside space. He didn't want to be here, but grudgingly agreed he probably needed to after lying on the cold floor of the passageway of his old fisherman's cottage for days. They had thought he was dead when they'd found him. "I can't come in every day, Dad. You know that. I've been in Birmingham all week. What if I'd stayed an extra day? They asked me to stay an extra day to make sure things run smoothly. I'd have lost you." Laura broke down at that. Accepting that her job helping recovering addicts was important, and that she would struggle to keep her mind on her work if images of him dead on the ground kept assaulting her, he agreed to come here. Bland. Everything was bland. His room benefited from a dated pine wardrobe that was old-fashioned, not old enough to be quality, not hewn from solid medieval oak or put together with Edwardian tongue-and-groove joints. This was a doweled and screwed flat pack from somewhere where style was a luxury that came at a price. The pine had yellowed over time and underlined how nothing matched or complemented anything else. The magnolia walls, an orange cellular blanket, red and green curtains. He was no interior designer. Laura's mum had been the one to make a home, but this was dreadful. He understood. Guests didn't always stay long, so decorating to individual tastes wasn't practical. Oh, to be young, he'd have it covered with posters of sports cars and/or those attractive bands they liked. Jazz it up a bit, but he only needed to sleep there. The lounge and day room were equally tasteless, but also noisy. The only place to escape beige was the garden. Escape was too big a word. The floor was green, some hideous plastic representation of grass that made him feel like a moldy, forgotten fruit in a greengrocer. Did they even have those anymore? It was all supermarkets nowadays. The brochures showed wonderful views, but they must be for visitors. Whilst you're in the area paying a visit to some old git who probably doesn't even remember you, don't worry. The day doesn't have to be a complete write-off. Look at the lovely surroundings. Tenby Beaches and Harbor, Saundersfoot with its 3 beaches and waterside restaurants. There were larger pictures of the ones from the brochure dotted around on walls, just to remind you how awfully unscenic the place was. Surrounding the grass was panel fencing fashionable in the 1980s and a small wooden pergola for shelter. Arthur initially believed it was so you could appreciate the outside, even on inclement days. How naive. It was for smoking. It was frowned upon, but seen as a basic human right. It certainly spoiled his contentment at being outside, his enjoyment of the plastic grass and the panel fence. Beyond that was the busy road that whizzed holidaymakers into the cobbled streets behind the ancient curtain wall of the old town. How many even glanced at the nursing home and thought about all the people inside, people who had lived through the war, pioneers of the lives they were free to enjoy now. None of them, he supposed. In the small outside space, an old lady in a wheelchair was being talked at loudly by a fat lady in joggers and a t-shirt. It wasn't rudeness. The woman was completely deaf. She didn't seem to notice or care that she had a visitor. Abruptly, the fat lady marched away. It looked purposeful, so Arthur expected her to return with a member of staff and demand some improvement to the wheelchair lady's care. Perhaps she would, but as time passed, it seemed more unlikely. Maybe they'd be forgotten about out here. Arthur hoped so. With a humph, he realized a book would have been a good thing to bring out. Engrossed in a story, his peripheral sight might be fooled. He was sat on real grass, and the paneled fence was a dense woodland. Now he was forced to stare at nothing. Knots in the wood made faces. He chuckled. There was a dog, a lion, a monkey, lots of the classic 1960s aliens. Big heads, almond eyes, plenty of those. And then his head jolted back with a gasp. He shook his head in little jerks, determined to right his cognizance, which seemed to have become confused. But as the movement of the inanimate fence grew undeniable, he wished he could convince himself it was another symptom of whatever was wrong with his brain. Arthur clutched his chest. He squeezed his eyes to almost shut and shook his head. "Bloody hell," he cried. Looking across at his compatriot, she sat oblivious to everything, muttering incoherently under her breath. As he looked back, he expected the anomaly would have returned to normal, but no. The face he'd last focused on grew from and protruded from the fence post. Arthur darted his head around to see if there were staff nearby. Perhaps the woman's chubby relative with one of the nurses. It had moved more. He couldn't take his eyes off it, or he feared he'd look around and it would be touching him. Grotesquely, the wood morphed into large, repugnant facial features. Limbs followed. Spindly granite arms, then a chest and legs. A monster stepping out of the fence. Eyes straining against what couldn't possibly be true, took all of Arthur's vigor. Muscles weakened in terror hindered escape. Other muscles, too, gave way, testing the tina pads as Arthur relinquished what little control he retained over his bladder and bowels. The sensation of wetness and the sudden stench of his mess didn't register. At 81, nothing had scared him for a long time. Even slumped on the path to his garden, as day turned to night again and again, and death seemed certain and imminent, he hadn't been afraid. He was not here, in this care home, because he was concerned with it happening again. He was convinced it probably would. A complete surprise when it happened the first time. He moved one way. His hips didn't get the message, and between locked knees and arthritic ankles, hitting the floor was unavoidable. Of course, he'd been more careful since, but hips still caught him out even now, with all the help he received. To do every little thing. Neither traitorous joint had broken, luckily. Hurt like hell, but he grew used to that pretty quickly. Once his body realized the pain signals weren't making him leap back to his feet, they gave up, leaving him to contentedly do the same. Laura had been amazed how calm he was when she'd found him. "You must be freezing, and you haven't eaten or drank for days." That surprised him the most. 3 days was the limit of human endurance without water, he had been taught. He must be superhuman. Fear now was a surprise, and he didn't understand. Did he think the thing would kill him? So what if it did? Was it the pain that whatever it was might inflict, tearing him limb from limb or hurling him at the ground? He doubted it could hurt, much more than the fall, and at least it would be quick. Realization wormed its way into his thoughts. It was fear not for himself, but for everybody else. The thing might kill him, and he was fine with that, but it wouldn't stop there, would it? As it drew closer, all the thoughts crashed together. Saving himself was never a consideration, but a scream to warn the others for what good it would. Do took all his energy. The creature loomed over him. He couldn't quite see it all, like it was a construct of his imagination, just as it had been when it was a pattern in the wood. It was solid, then translucent in alternating moments. If it had claws or vicious teeth, he couldn't tell, but as it stood, leaned an inch from his face, death gripped before the pain was felt. A great nausea failed to achieve a liquid form, swirling around his body and his head. He knew the sensation. It was like several things he had suffered before. The G-force of a jet plane as he dangled from the straps, desperately swallowing. Down a jam sandwich he'd been advised to eat as the only thing that tasted the same coming up as it did going down. Or more recently, the waltzer at Porthcawl as the "scream if you want to go faster" instruction was paid full heed by the fairground man as his grandson, Owen, did just that. He'd survived the jet, but almost lost consciousness on that bloody fairground ride. Now, with the monster almost touching him, he thought how his scream had made him go faster, or something. His brain struggled for coherence until there was nothing. Nothing at all. My grandmother hasn't even got... A blanket out here, it's a disgrace. It might be warm for you lot, because you're young and busy, but sitting completely still. It's a wonder she hasn't frozen to death. Muttered apologies that would later be retracted in the handover her coffee break at 7, when the lady's daughter would be called all sorts. The care worker balanced on one leg to use her other to fumble the break off so she could wheel her back inside. She gave the briefest glance towards Arthur and hoped the ruckus hadn't woken him. She could have asked him, but didn't. If they weren't complaining, it was best to leave them to it, because you never knew when they would start complaining. Nadicha Airport. If his mum was being truthful, what did it mean? He rephrased his own question. Of course she was telling the truth. He trusted she always did that, but that didn't mean she didn't get confused. But what if the creatures crawling out of the walls were real and not a hallucination, a symptom of her paranoid delusions? The fact he was being dragged back to Alaska provided a convincing case that what she'd experienced was a solid, tangible certainty. It would be because of the frequency change, he felt sure. Or what else could he offer them? Molly would be pleased to see him, but he felt unsettled. This wasn't how he had planned it. Plans changing had always been a source of stress, and more so when he didn't fully understand why. What is the plan? Why are you taking me? I'll be honest, my friend. I am not entirely sure. They don't tell me everything. In this case, all I know is there has been an unwanted development that you might be able to assist with. Learning on my arrival of your mother's experience was the first I'd heard about it. To answer your question, do I believe her? The jury is still out. Let's just say I'm used to working on a need-to-know basis. And some of the things I've needed to know, I wish I didn't. If what your mama says is true, I guess we can add it to my list. Perhaps it was unrelated. There were so many things that might have arisen as a result of Earth's recent vibrational frequency shift at the hands of the Aryans. Believing everything his mother said was not advised. She'd seen a lot of things which sounded crazy but were real, but she was paranoid and delusional, of that there was no doubt. Until he saw evidence. Himself, he would remain cautious. Briefly, they joined traffic, traveling away from the peace of Pembrokeshire. The motorway soon gave way to more country roads, and they headed for Swansea's small airport on the Gower Peninsula. The light reflecting on either side of the road from the sea produced an eerie luminosity. Ebe tried to lock it in his mind, to remember his home when he was back in Alaska. The FBI agent had alluded it wouldn't take long to assist with whatever was going on. But considering he almost certainly didn't understand, it seemed like an empty promise. Anxiety bubbled in his throat, and he fought to keep it in. Whatever it was, he would be capable. He hadn't met a problem yet that he hadn't been able to solve. As the car wove around the twisting and narrow country lanes, it struck Ebe as an odd place for an airport. Did the authorities have a different plan for him? Had he become a liability? He had been exposed to a lot of secrets, many, of which would cause catastrophic panic if they were leaked. Sweat beaded his hairline, causing a triangular shard of hair to fall in his eyes. Chubby fingers brushed it away, but its weight seduced it to fall again. Time after time the fringe dropped onto Ebe's face, and each time he swept it away, with increasing ferocity. "You okay there, boy?" The agent turned from the window to look at him. No, he wasn't. This muddy track didn't look like the road to the airport, so why was he in a car with a man with a gun heading into the middle of nowhere? The driver veered sharply. Swansea Airport, a sign advised, and Ebe sighed with relief. He nodded, oddly late, to the question of his being okay, and the man shook his head, muttering under his breath. A potholed track led them to another marker confirming their arrival, beyond which, and a woven wire fence, a small plane stood, on the runway. Ebe nodded admiration. A private jet. Nice. He missed the introduction of the pilot. He didn't like to look at people, and would be unlikely to remember his name anyway. The sooner the formality was over, and he could be seated, ready for takeoff, the better. With a nod and an upwards turn of his lips, he understood what was expected. He bobbed into the passenger area where he struggled to choose a seat. His decision was based on various factors: where Nathan and the other man would sit, the safest part in the event of an emergency landing, and comfort. Comfort was easy. Each seat had good legroom. It didn't help, though. He couldn't know where they would pick until they'd chosen, and waiting until they had sat to make his selection would appear rude. His breaths grew rapid and he bobbed, his head in sharp jerks. Finding fault in computer code or working out a mathematical conundrum was straightforward, but trying to guess where a human might sit on an aeroplane was beyond his capabilities. Nathan Dale and his operative squeezed past Ebe and peered at him as they reclined in conversation. When Ebe sat away from them and by the door, they didn't react. The window took his unblinking attention, but there wasn't much to see. Another useful ploy to avoid interaction with the strangers he was being forced to travel thousands of miles with. The fence and beyond, the car park, where a small number of cars occupied the front spaces, began to blur as the plane picked up pace. Taxiing to the beginning of the runway, it came to a controlled halt. Ebe knew what was next. They'd zoom off until velocity sufficed to create the lift needed to propel them into the sky. What were they waiting for? As time passed, it seemed Ebe wasn't the only one to notice it was taking longer than usual. Nathan leaned into his colleague, and after an exchange, the man Ebe knew was armed stood and walked to the cockpit. He pulled the curtain aside and disappeared from view. The curtain flew back and cries of, "Oh my God!" echoed back, muffled. "Wait there," Nathan ordered, as he pulled his own gun from a holster hidden beneath his jacket and hurried up the plane. Shit! He wouldn't wait for whatever emergency he'd been told stay seated for killed him. But he wasn't foolish enough to rush headlong into danger either. But danger found him. The other agent fell through the curtain to the sound of shattering glass. The plane swerved and Nathan jumped over him to get to Ebe. "Stay down." He seemed sure in what he was saying, so Ebe obeyed reluctantly. What was happening? An obstacle on the runway didn't explain their reactions. Was he really in the best place, hiding? He'd rather know what he was shielding from. The wheels left the tarmac, but over the rough grass, not into the air. "See us." Jolt knocked Nathan to the floor. Ebe pushed from his seat to stand, his weight giving momentum to propel him towards the door, but as he tried to step further, the shakiness dropped him back to seated. The clack, clack, clack of the aircraft running the length of the fence, slowing with each prang, gave them hope they might stop safely. But Nathan forced himself up and forward against the inertia. He had no experience flying an aircraft of this size. Short of a large lever being labeled brake, he wasn't likely to be able to help, but he couldn't lay on the floor and give up. It wasn't his style. Re-entering the cabin, the pilot and co-pilot weren't moving, and his colleague laid slumped on the floor. He had time to ascertain the dials and switches meant nothing to him, and that there were no impending fatal impacts looming. The pilot probably steered a course to slow the taxiing plane down when he wasn't feeling well, much the same as he might steer a speeding car into a hedge if he lost control. It had been worth the effort, he thought, as he jolted back onto the floor, because now, as he was forced to stare at the ceiling, he felt safe. As soon as they stopped, he and Ebe could help the crew out, and everyone would make it out alive. Then he'd begin to ask the questions, like, what on earth happened? To the three of them, alerted to the imminent stop, already braced, they came to a relatively safe standstill. Ebe stood slowly and looked at Nathan lying on the floor. There was a gash on his head. Instinctively, he bent over and hovered his hand over until the wound healed. What happened? Left. Out in the cold. Lucky she didn't freeze to death, the stupid old cow had the cheek to say. If she came to see her mum more than once a year, maybe she would realize when she feels the cold. She was fine, of course, probably loving it out there. After the outburst, she had to sit in the day room with all the noise. It's like, all our training is for nothing, another worker agreed. If they're so keen to think they know it all, perhaps they should be the ones looking after them, eh? They don't want the work, but don't like to let us do it. Guilty, I reckon. Take it out on us, they do. Yeah, 'cause they can't be bothered, a quiet new girl added to the conversation, receiving looks projecting, we literally just said that. The other girls nodded. There were only so many ways to say the same thing. Visitors had all left now, so what they thought was irrelevant. Anything else we should be aware of? No, I don't think so. Nothing out of the ordinary, at any rate. The afternoon shifters finally left to raucous goodbyes, leaving an unenthusiastic night shift to clear away the dinner trays. Some would be untouched, and they would need to encourage them to eat. It looked disgusting when it came out of the hot trolley. Lukewarm trolley, more like. There was a fine line between risk of salmonella and risk of burning, so for the slow eaters it soon became unappetizingly cold. Trying to spoon mouthfuls between reluctant lips was infuriating. Not making aeroplane or choo-choo train noises took restraint. It would probably work as well. Others gave a more eager eating performance. Unfortunately, that led to food being everywhere but the tray. The cleanup would take ages. The necessitated change of clothes was the reason nightwear was changed. Into shortly after dinner. Let's make you all cozy, shall we? Get jimajama, one nurse suggested, and began to sing a bedtime song as she did every night. With a frown and a sigh, one of the workers stood, holding a tray aloft. Whose is this? She wafted it jaggedly around, irritation tightening her grip. Untouched. What a waste of food. She brought the plate lower so everyone could see how much had been wasted. Come on, one of you must know. Where's Arthur? Maybe it's his. Nobody moved, so the tray holder shouted, Somebody go and find him. Check his room, the toilet. Perhaps he's not feeling well. She turned the irritation to concern and potentially blame if the guest had been left somewhere thoughtlessly by the previous shift. A young nurse bustled down the corridor. With a gentle knock, she opened Arthur's door when he didn't answer. The bed was made, duvet cover pulled tight so Arthur, or anybody else, hadn't sat or leant on it. The bouquet of cleaning products lingered. No fetid breath nor bodily odors had filled the room since morning clean. She was sure he wasn't in the dining room, the day rooms, one quiet, peaceful contemplation place with soft lighting and shade, and the other with music, games, TV, and entertainment. Now most of the residents were in their sleep clothes. Some went straight to their beds, whilst others were proper night owls and had to be physically persuaded to go. Entering the busy room first, the healthcare worker looked around. It was easier than one might imagine not to be certain if a particular person was present. Hair coloring and build were all similar. Everyone was sat huddled together or hunched facing away from her and towards the TV. She walked in front of them and met each gaze in turn to be sure. Have any of you seen young Arthur? Young because he was in his 80s rather than 90s. And because she called all of them that, usually to gratified giggles. It was a benefit of spending time with sufferers of poor memory. You could recycle jokes several times a day and nobody complained. The down-turned mouths and gentle headshakes indicated no one had. Never mind, he can't have got far. Could he? He wasn't as infirm as some of the others. The doors and gates were locked, but a visitor may have inadvertently let him out. Heart palpitating, she investigated the quiet room, which was empty, but she still went fully inside and looked at every conceivable hiding space. Shaking her, head mystified, her gaze rose to the window and darkness outside. The nights had drawn in rapidly this year, and the clocks hadn't even gone back yet. A surge of panic giddied her. Cold now, it had been quite warm earlier. Could he be in the garden still? He was mobile, a walker. If he was out there, it would be after a fall. Feet tripping over one another in her haste. She didn't want to alarm anyone if he was completely fine. There were yet perfectly harmless explanations. His daughter may have taken him out for the night, and the day shift forgot to log it. The more she thought about that as she approached the door, the more it seemed the most likely explanation, until she saw him. A few meters away, on a chair pulled onto the astroturf facing the wooden fence, the upright body of an aged gentleman she recognized as Arthur sat motionless. "Arthur," she called lightly. If he was sleeping, she wanted to wake him gently, rather than shock him at close proximity. "Arthur," she announced again, a little louder. Her concern grew with each hesitant step towards her elderly resident. "Arthur," she said one last time as she reached him and turned to face him. "Oh my God!" Protocol said she needed another nurse present, but in case there was a chance, she patted his cheeks and shook his shoulders. Calling for help, hopelessness redoubled, and she gulped down her sorrow, guilt, and grief so she could cry for assistance. It was just protocol, though. There was no doubt. Arthur was dead. 6. Rhiannon's faint hope. Karis held back her emotions. For 2 years she had lived in mental prison. Her only company a range of deranged other inmates. There were occasional lucid moments, but none so cogent as to provide sensible conversation for very long. Just when Karis thought she was getting somewhere, the exchange would turn to their particular foible being relevant. The reincarnation of Hitler or Napoleon, Almighty God, an extraterrestrial in disguise, were some oddities she contended with until it became too much, and she saved up all her tablets to take them all at once. She'd known then she didn't want to die. A faith that her son would one day return sustained her, kept her committed to therapies and medication. Eventually, as her behavior became placid, or what they called normal, they helped her to come off the medicine. Slowly, cutting down only half a tablet a week and monitoring everything. Her mood, her organ functions, her weight, she'd come off it all. Asked if she had the hallucinations still, the Amish man and the man in disguise, Rebecca, popped up in her mind's eye but ignored, soon skulked back into the shadows. And of course, she still believed outrageous things, like her husband had morphed into a reptilian monster right in front of her, and that her only son was genetically half an extraterrestrial himself. But she didn't consider those ideas foolish. Forewarned that others did meant she could easily deny elements that would discourage them from letting her go, from reversing her section. And he returned, just as he promised, only to disappear again after less than a day. She sighed. It wasn't fair. The police sergeant was staring at her. Ever since Ebe and that big gorilla of a Texan left, he had stared constantly, only dipping his gaze if she tried to catch his eye. He reached a hand across and patted her arm. "Are you all right?" There was a loaded question. Of course she wasn't. His duty of care meant she needed to answer that inquiry carefully. He believed her, so he said. But he could still decide. The best thing would be to section her into the supervision of St. Caradogs again. It was conceivable he'd be overruled on the matter. Technically, without Ebe, her staying at the hotel was against their instruction. The nice sergeant wouldn't know that, so to ensure a choice, she would need to steer him away from asking them. Then she wondered if she might not be better there anyway, although monsters crawling out of the walls wouldn't be hampered by a psychiatric nurse. Their training didn't extend to protection from actual monsters, merely the ones in her head. If there was nothing they could do to help her, she would rather be out here and in control. So she answered, "I'm fine, missing my boy, but okay. With luck, he'll be back in a few days, and I can celebrate being with him again. If you're asking if I need any extra help, the answer's no, thank you. I'll do fine on my own." Rex blew through his lips. If he hadn't been warned she was a recent resident of the mental ward, he wouldn't know it from talking to her. Her rocking when he arrived was usual for the mentally unwell, but also for those in shock. Having met Ebe and Nathan Dale, having seen something peculiar and believing it to be real was not the gauge of insanity, or that she was not fit to care for herself that it would otherwise indicate. Protocol, on the other hand, was another matter, one he was bound to by law. Do you have anyone, professionally you could contact if you needed them? I mean, now you're out of hospital. Yes, thank you. I have my very own community, psychiatric nurse who I can call. I doubt they'd give me the same respect you have shown, though, Sergeant. Rex smiled. I must confirm I'm not leaving a vulnerable member of the public without the care she needs, or I'll be in trouble. He shook his head. The paperwork, if I get it wrong. Oh, you wouldn't believe. I would. My dad was a sergeant for years. Paperwork was the bane of his life. Well, one of them. A moment of awkward silence was broken when Karis asked, So, what will you put in your report? That is an excellent question. No crime has been committed, and no accusations of crime are being made. So really, I don't need to take a statement. I'll ask you to sign to the effect I've been advised psychiatric care is available, and that you have elected to stay here. If you don't mind. Of course not. That is what you want, isn't it? To stay here? Karis sighed. Good a place as any. Infinite improvement over the ward. Lovely views, nice staff. I just hope this morning's experience was a one-off. To be honest, it would suit me right down to the ground if it had been a hallucination. An overload of my senses after being cooped up for 2 years with a bunch of nutters. Do you think it might be? Is it possible you imagined it? Eyes, squinting at the ceiling. At the moment, I'd have to say absolutely not. But these things have a habit of becoming less convincing the more time goes by. To be honest, I am struggling to recall exactly what they looked like. Maybe I was having a crazy 5 minutes. Let's just say I was, shall we? That whatever my son and that FBI agent are up to, it's got nothing to do with it. I think I'll sleep better that way. Me too, Karis, me too. What happened, Tracy? Rhiannon, the senior care worker, frowned at her subordinate. I just found him. The day shift must have left him out here. Blame apportioned, Rhiannon relaxed a bit. Silly sods. Have you called an ambulance? He's dead, isn't he? Tracy flushed with panic. Could she have saved him? Should she have been trying resuscitation? Duty led her over to him, and she reached out her hand to begin. Don't touch him. But if I can, save him. Rhiannon shook her head, lips pressing the color from one another until her whole countenance was a wishy-washy gray. Oh no, he's definitely dead. Then, why do we need an ambulance? It's unexpected. He wasn't suffering from anything terminal, or rather, he hadn't been diagnosed, hasn't been with us long. Really healthy until a few months ago, then had a really nasty fall and was left in a cold passageway in his garden for nearly a week. Oh my God, that's awful. How did he survive? He couldn't eat or drink, presumably? Well, no, of course not. Dunno, is the simple answer. He checked in here shortly after. Been fine, but it must be dementia or Parkinson's or something, don't you think? She said, rubbing her arms for warmth. You stay out here. I'll call the paramedics. They're qualified to call the death. I know. She responded to an assumed objection. Aren't we trained to tell? Don't we have more experience with the elderly passing than they do? Tracy must be thinking. Rhiannon smiled as she reached the corded landline in the hallway. With 9 pressed firmly the requisite 3 times, Rhiannon waited for the response. Ambulance, please. An unexpected death of one of our residents. Handset replaced. She told another of the team that an ambulance would arrive anywhere in the next 10 minutes to 4 hours, depending on how busy they were. I'm going to catch up with some paperwork in my office. Let me know when the paramedics get here. Don't disturb me until then. Her staggered walk would be a telltale sign of distress to an observer, but no one here had the presence of mind, nor the time, nor the inclination for that matter to observe or to care. As she reached her room, she opened the door and stepped purposefully through the doorway, pushing the door to a gentle click and turning the key to ensure her privacy. She leaned against it, a sob worming its way from her despite her best intentions, and her hand flying to her mouth to stop it. It never got any easier. Brisk bravado might fool the others. It had even gained her the reputation for being a cold-hearted bitch, or so she was sure she had overheard. It suited her because it was a worthwhile trait, caring detachment. That was the way forward in this game. Anything else was impossible. It was losing her dad and her mum, and her bloody dog, and then the audacity of Her Majesty the Queen leaving us. Why had that upset her so much? She never even knew the woman. When she visited Pembrokeshire a few years ago to encourage a few selected small businesses, Rhiannon hadn't gone out of her way to see the late monarch. Not that she didn't want to. It was more she didn't care. It always seemed like everyone was expected to experience all the time in the world. She accepted the monarch would have to die someday. Of course she did. Although the idea of her sending a congratulatory telegram to herself amused her. She had suspected when she wasn't able to perform that simple task for her beloved Philip that she wouldn't make it herself. She saw it, oh, so many times. Husbands lasted even less time when they lost their wives. Not all of them, of course. And she didn't think it was simply down to love, because she met many spouses whom she was certain were besotted with their better halves, but who lived decades without them. But half the time, a year or so was all they could muster. At least the Queen's own mother got one. It was the unexpected ones that upset her. She didn't know why. Her mum died from a decade-long protracted illness, and her dad succumbed to a sudden onset of cancer, but still he'd lasted 3 years after they gave him months to live. Arthur had seemed so full of life, almost like he didn't belong here. It goes to show, she thought, allowing herself to sit at last. Face hidden, she wept. For Arthur, her late Majesty, Mum and Dad, and that bloody dog. When would she ever get over her? Yes? She answered a knock at the door, smearing tears from her cheeks with the heels of her hands. They're here, the paramedics. What should I tell them? Rhiannon sighed. Why did no one know how to do anything apart from her? Don't worry, I'm coming. Caris stayed in the communal lounge and basked in the company of the other guests, not to speak to. So far, the only normal conversation she had been a part of since leaving the hospital had been the 5 minutes choosing a television program to fall asleep to with Ebe last night. Strangers was something she hadn't encountered for years and would take a while to get used to. But watching them from a reserved distance while she nursed her mug of tea, which was the best she'd had in years. A superior brand, better quality water, or most likely simply the secure knowledge that the cup was clean and had not been used for any unsavory purpose, some of which were so revolting she wished she couldn't bring them so clearly to mind, and yearned for the day they would become a distant memory, so remote as to be one of those "is it even real?" type thoughts. She'd sufficed with canned drinks from the vending machine and had been sure to wash those whenever possible. A child entered the room, male probably, but very pretty, so difficult to tell. The child's mother answered, a whispered question, laughing at first, and afterwards with a controlled frown and pointed finger. Not before bed, Bailey. You know that. Erudition of the child's name didn't help. Of course, it mattered not one bit, but it ignited a curiosity. Smiling, Caris chuckled as she fought a full-on laugh for fear it would attract questions she was unwilling and unable to answer. What was so funny? For years, the conundrums assaulting her consciousness, day upon day, were so vile. Was the tea she drank fit for human consumption? Would another inmate attack or even attempt to kill her? Would today be the one Ebe came to fetch her? Would she ever leave this hellhole? Simply wondering the gender of a cute 5-year-old was the most innocuous thing she'd considered in quite some time. Don't forget to brush your teeth, there's a good boy, and the innocent inquiry was lost. Caris's face dropped, and she hugged her tea to her in an attempt to reconnect with the cozy feelings creeping up on her. Her mind quickly fell into familiar patterns, and soon she was analyzing what might have happened this morning. When reporting to the sergeant, the pictures had become fuzzy. She probably could have been convinced anything other than the truth, was the explanation. But truth is what it was. The images in her recollection were still no clearer, but the surefire wisdom that she had witnessed something palpable was unshakable. What did it mean? Well, it was them, wasn't it? Come to torment her again. They looked different, but she was happy to add them to the list of peculiar extraterrestrials who had plagued her life since she was Bailey's age. With a gulp, she hoped her interest in the boy wasn't because she sensed something in him. A kindred spirit, so to speak, or worse, that her curiosity in him would attract their attention. No, it didn't work like that. Motive was obvious. Under Marco, God rest his hideous reptilian soul, she had been controlled, unable to tell anyone her beliefs. Not anybody who would listen anyway. Or rather, anybody not certified as mentally incapable. She hadn't been about to break that protocol, or had she? As Ebe told her things, might she have old hatreds stirred up enough to try to make a difference? Ebe didn't need her anymore. Her dad had disappeared from the face of the earth, or Thailand, and her mum was dead. There was no one around who cared about her, so taking risks and telling all would be no bother to her. Apart from Stella. A pang in her chest for her old childminder and confidant, whom she hadn't seen in years, stopped her short. She'd laughed inappropriately minutes ago, and now hearty sobs rocked her body as she hid her face in her hands. Go on, Bailey. Off you go. Quick sticks. Mummy and Daddy are coming up as well. Come on, I'll race you. Was the hurried exit born from tact, or from concern that the nutty lady in the corner might be about to attack them, or at the very least behave in a way that would be difficult to explain to a curious 5-year-old? It didn't matter. She was alone. In the room, in her heart, and in her mind. Rocking to regain equilibrium, her gaze began constructing pictures in the patterned wallpaper, boats, cars, a squirrel, all flitted in, subconsciously for consideration, but inevitably, eyes, a mouth, and, oh look, there's his little nose. Karis stopped. With a shake of her head to dispel the image, she closed her eyelids and sat very still. If they were going to crawl out of the wall and devour her, she didn't want to see. When did you call the ambulance? The concerned paramedic who had introduced himself as Ryan peered up at Rhiannon and Tracy as he knelt before the deceased presence of Arthur Bowen. This chap has been dead for hours. Rhiannon gulped. When? Was it, Tracy? A while ago, wasn't it? We got the call at 20:37. Less than half an hour. Ryan's partner spoke from his lofty height behind the two healthcare workers. Who discovered the body? Bronwyn was quick to indicate her young colleague, who stammered words Rhiannon would have rather kept to themselves. We couldn't find him after dinner, so I looked in his room and in the 2 sitting rooms, the quiet one and the activity one. When he wasn't there, I got to wondering if he might have gone outside and been forgotten about. That's exactly what I was thinking. Ryan's partner, Jeff, crossed his arms over his broad chest and sneered down at them. The police will have to be called. What? Why? Tracy blurted, eyes moistening at the news, focusing, just long enough to catch the venomous glare from her manager. Suspicious death, Ryan finally stood, having failed to uncover a pulse or any other signs of life. Time of death 21:37, he jotted on a pad. No, it's not, Tracy almost wailed. He was old. Can't last forever, you know. Ryan raised his eyebrows. Sorry, forgive me. Was Arthur diagnosed with a terminal condition? Apart from old age, that is? Rhiannon decided to field any more questions. She should have kept her inexperienced colleague out of the way. We aren't aware of a specific diagnosis, no, but he was brought to us having experienced a fall and loss of function you might associate with an onset of neurological disease of some sort. But no diagnosis? Rhiannon was forced to shake her head to confirm what she'd said 3 times already. Because if cause of death is recorded as hypothermia, there will be an investigation and likely disciplinary action. His head shaking, Ryan took a deep breath to fuel the long sigh he used to express his disgust diplomatically. "Police are on their way," Jeff informed them, re-entering the room when Rhiannon and Tracy hadn't noticed his departure. Christmas jobless loomed as a possibility in Rhiannon's head. She'd inherited her parental home, which had seemed a blessing, and was, of course, mortgageless at 49. The upkeep on the old house was more than she had ever imagined, and she'd been forced to use all her savings to maintain it. Doing things herself whenever she could, and doing extra shifts at the care home, as well as occasional waitressing and bar work to fund those jobs she couldn't, was a constant juggling match. If she lost her job, she could ask for more shifts at her other jobs. But if a conviction was obtained? She shuddered and tried to stop the tears springing from her eyes, but squeezing them shut had the effect of wringing the salty emotion from them. All this on top of the guilt and grief she was already suffering from. She found herself wishing Arthur had died long before it got cold, and that the coroner would be able to tell. "Okay, thank you," she managed to squeak as she made gesticulations, to indicate business and to excuse her leaving the room. Arms flapping, she looked more like an injured bird than a competent manager of a residential care facility. Ryan and Jeff were certainly unimpressed. "Can I get either of you a tea or coffee? We've got a machine full of soda, too, if you'd prefer?" "We're fine, thank you," Ryan answered for both of them. They weren't about to drink from the poisoned chalice of the incompetence that may or may not have killed a man. To busy himself, Ryan wrote a report of what they'd discovered, whilst Jeff took things out of their kit bag and repositioned them in slightly different places, which were supposedly a slight improvement. Tracy watched, picking at dead skin, around her fingernails with her other hand, glancing frequently at the door, wondering when and if her manager would return and if she could justify her own exit. No, the ambulance crew already thought ill of them. Every bit of professionalism she could muster might make the difference in how and what the police were told. Before hope gave way to resigned despondency, 2 more uniforms arrived in the room, followed shortly by Rhiannon. Once a quick chat with the paramedics confirmed death, they excused themselves and the police continued their business. Jeff and Ryan left with the smallest goodbyes, their views on what might have killed Arthur uncertain. Their belief that he'd been neglected required the unfriendly exit. "Who discovered the deceased?" Tracy was asked again. This time, she kept her answer short and to the point. It made little difference. Now they were here, they were going by the book. Tracy and Rhiannon braced for the outcome. "We'll call the coroner and arrange collection," one officer said, not specifying what. "Cause and time of death will be established, and we'll take it from there." "When will we know?" Tracy mumbled. "If we need to ask any more questions, we'll be in touch." The other officer answered further. "If you're concerned, you can call the station. Ask for PC Dan or Gary. One of us should be able to put you out of your misery." How did he end up being left out here undiscovered? Anyway, he sounded so chummy. Tracy was lulled to be over-talkative again. The police seemed unmoved. They dealt with far more malevolent deaths, she supposed. Resentment rose but quickly fell for the misunderstanding from the ambulance crew. They did care. No one took a job caring for infirm old people if they didn't care. She loved every one of them. Arthur dying unexpectedly like this was tragic and upsetting without all the red tape issues. The police accepted tea and then chatted with the other residents who were still awake. It seemed friendly, but Tracy suspected they were gathering evidence. Was leaving residents to fend for themselves the norm, perhaps? The ambulance for the coroner arrived, who was actually the local funeral director with whom they were all too familiar. He nodded reverentially and spoke with a quiet respect as he and colleagues packaged poor Arthur up for removal. Discreetly taking the rear exit through the garden so as not to upset any of the other guests, Arthur's stiffening corpse was removed from the care facility. Stepping back into the hallway, where Rhiannon, Tracy, and the 2 police officers had gathered, the funeral director spoke in hushed tones. We'll take Mr. Bowen to the mortuary, and the pathologist can perform his duty and be in touch, okay? Do you know what will happen to Mr. Bowen's remains? Everyone shook their heads. That's fine. It will be up to his next of kin, of course, but we would be happy to take up the burden on your behalf. Here's my card if you would like, to discuss moving forward. He bowed and nodded as he backed out of the door. So sorry for your loss, he said as his parting statement. Rhiannon sighed. Never before had she had to contact a next of kin so soon after admission. It would raise questions she hoped the forensic pathologist would answer with confirmation of an undiagnosed fatal condition. As hopes went, it wasn't exactly inspirational, but it was all she had. 7 emergency precautions. Ebe was a hefty lad, but his technique of moving the pilot and the others was boggling. Judging with perfection, he balanced the stricken crew over his big arms and deftly swung through the door opening in wince-inducing rapidity before running with them much further from the aircraft than safety precautions would dictate. If the whole thing blew up in front of them, they'd be safe. Nathan smiled and bowed to the sensibilities of his hybrid charge. He brought his phone down from his ear as he reached them. Someone inside has already called an ambulance, he said, as a crew of staff ran across the runway toting fire extinguishers. Are you guys all right? A bright girl asked through steamed glasses. What happened? I'd like to know the same. I would advise no flights to take place until we've debriefed. Whatever caused this crash could be a threat to your pilots, too. I hope not. We have an afternoon chock full of skydiving booked. I'd hate to reschedule. Catching Nathan's cold stare, she added, but if it's necessary, of course we will. Customer safety is our top priority. Nathan flashed his FBI badge in a way that also showed her his holster. He always got his way. Sirens blared at least 3 minutes before they saw the big red fire and rescue truck screeching down the narrow lane to the airfield. As it grew larger in their vision, Nathan and Ebe and the Swansea airport staff watched, glanced back to the plane, which was perfectly fine and definitely not in flames, then at the pilot, co-pilot, and the other FBI agent who sat on the verge, conscious, if not drowsy, not at all appearing as though they needed rescuing. As it slowed to stop in front of them, the fire crew jumped out in full emergency mode, ready to pounce on any threat to safety. They almost looked disappointed to be standing down. All under control here, fellas, Nathan boomed, holding out his warrant badge again. The fewer people around to question his witnesses, the better. It might be nothing, but a flight arranged. To transport a VIP of international significance that was now grounded had to be taken seriously. Looking at his strange and chunky charge, it was difficult to consider what he was bringing that was of such importance. He'd given up questioning because so often the truth was stranger than any fiction he could conjure, so he just did as he was asked, providing he was asked nicely, of course. Any casualties? One fireman inquired, keen to help where he could. I'm a first responder, see. I'll give anyone the once-over before the ambulance gets here. If you think it's necessary, but I expect they'll be here soon. The fireman blew through his lips and let out a little chuckle. I wouldn't bet on it. Hours some people wait sometimes. And serious situations, too. If you sounded as unbothered as you do now, you'll be right down the list, I reckon. But, Nathan sighed, by all means, fella. Take a look. I want them to be all right, obviously. He watched nervously as the fireman approached the 3 casualties. His agent would say nothing untoward, of course, but these were ordinary pilots. If they'd seen something that caused them to faint, or if something had forced unconsciousness onto them, goodness knows what they'd have seen before it happened. And if they told, it was up to Nathan Dale to silence any witnesses. If had just been the pilot, he could have considered he might have had a cardiac arrest. But all 3 of them seemed like more malign. That worried him. He was here under strict direction from one lot of megalomaniac ETs. If different ones were preventing that from happening, it pointed to distinct factions. An alien war had to be avoided at all costs. He was getting ahead of himself. Collect Ebe and bring him back to Alaska had been his order. The rest of the story was conjecture from an active imagination fueled from a report by a self-confessed madwoman. Worrying what the two pilots might blurt out to the paramedics was overthinking, and if they did, his trusty badge and firearm would get him listened to, as they always did. The fireman had stepped over to them and introduced himself in a loud voice, as if Nathan had just told him they were deaf. "Hello, my name is Carl. I'm a firefighter with South Wales Fire and Rescue. I'm just going to ask you one or two questions to make sure you're all right, okay?" With a squint, the pilots and the FBI agent nodded. "I'll check you out one at a time, if that's okay." Turning to the pilot, he said, "First of all, can I get your name?" Still, just as loud. "Paul, did you say?" he boomed in response to the mumbled reply. "Okay, Paul, can I ask you, how many fingers am I holding up?" Nathan resisted the urge to unholster his handgun and shoot the cretinous fuckwit in the leg. Then he chuckled. If this was the level of questioning, it was unlikely internationally sensitive secrets were about to be revealed. Finger flicking. The clip on his holster opened, then closed. Open and closed, he watched, with increasing scorn, the procedure unfold. Following his finger, touching their nose, telling him the date and current president of the United States. Inquiring about the monarch of this shitty little island would be more up to date. Or didn't they have a different sovereign on the peninsula of Wales? The English prince? That's probably why he didn't ask. Sensitive subject around these parts. Once he'd completed his checks on the pilot, he moved on to the co-pilot and performed the same procedure in the same over-the-top booming voice in exactly the same way. Nathan shook his head. Rolling his eyes, it reminded him of something. It took him a moment to recognize what it was. The Eisteddfod. In schools throughout this weird little nation, they had this bizarre tradition, dating to medieval times. Eisteddfod, literally being the chair, he'd been told when he'd stood at the back of the school hallway, waiting to have a little chat with a boy who supposedly had footage of a UFO. He smiled. Another successful mission of misdirection, and thinly veiled threat had put that one to bed. But not before they had forced him to endure the excruciating Eisteddfod. Enthusiastic children bounded to the stage. Some sang, some recited a poem, and others performed a short play. It had all been in Welsh, which was irritating enough, but then it got worse. Once completed, more kids bobbed onto the stage and presented the exact same song, poem, and play. Then more and more and more. When he'd seen the same thing over a dozen times, he thought it must be some sort of test, or that he had fallen through a gap in reality and was existing in a nightmare world created from his distaste for the backwards country he'd been forced to attend a number of times in recent years. But looking around, other adults, they had, to be parents of the precocious little shits on stage. No one was coming here to watch for any other reason than necessity. Were all clapping and cheering enthusiastically. If it were him, when little Johnny, or Siani, as it would be here, he sneered to himself. He'd had the intricacies of Welsh language thrust at him by too many locals for it not to stick. Asked at dinner, "Did you see me in the Eisteddfod?" "Dad?" He'd take great delight in putting him in his place and yelling, "No, of course I damned well didn't, because I'm not a pussy little poet boy." When it was over, and he'd been able to meet with his suspect, he learned that there was an adult version, too. This was the Urd variant, the Urd being represented by some weird little stripy triangular guy with arms and legs protruding from a prism and a big smiley face. He couldn't talk. Nathan wished the oddity was more of an inspiration and the whole lot of them would shut the hell up. Curiosity led him to the internet to discover there was an international Eisteddfod. He'd almost deleted Google. When the first responder fireman finished his neurological examination, oh, that's what that was, Nathan forced a sickly smile. He informed him that everything seemed okay. Responses were a bit slow, but it could just be the shock. No shit, Sherlock. They'll probably need to go to hospital for some scans just to be on the safe side. I would have liked to have seen their necks secure. I'm tempted to do it now, but it seems a little pointless as they've been sitting unrestrained for a while before I got here." Nathan nodded vigorously. "Pointless, yes. Beat it, you over-enthusiastic child." It seemed like he just wanted to seem important, having ridden in the big red fire engine. Nathan checked he wasn't pouting. He didn't want this idiot to prolong things out of spite. The sooner he could get a proper debrief, the better. More blue lights illuminated the lane, and 2 ambulances veered down towards them. They'd better not insist on the same exasperating tests, or he might lose his temper. As the ambulances pulled in, the fire truck drove away. The crews got out in a calmer way than the fire and rescue team had. In a brisk amble, 3 men and 1 woman approached. The skydiving unit had lost interest and sauntered back inside one by one, leaving Nathan alone with Ebe and the patients and paramedics. "Who have we got here, then?" one of them asked with a beaming smile. Similar checks were done and similar conclusions reached. Nothing too serious going on, but some slowness in response meant a trip to hospital was the advised course of action. "We can wait for another ambulance, or you could drive your friend yourself, if you prefer." Nathan dreaded leaving the pilots at the mercy of the paramedics' crews, fearing they might let something slip in their delirium. He reminded himself that he didn't know if there was anything to be worried about. His gut told him there was, though. Jitteriness rested unnaturally on his shoulders. Something was up, of that he was certain. Taking Agent Harris to hospital meant he had reason to be there, which was useful, but what to do with Ebe? He decided a direct question wouldn't be risky. For a genius savior of the world, his hybrid responsibility seemed a simple man. "Say, Ebe, do you want to hang around the hospital? If you'd prefer to get some food in the city, I can give you cash." "I have money. When are we leaving for Alaska?" "Soon. Not today. We'll need new transport and pilots. And I think it's important to know what happened." "Any ideas?" Ebe shrugged. "They fainted? They are not familiar with the latest vibration of the Earth. It must not be an uncommon phenomenon." Ebe didn't seem to want to talk further on the matter. A disinterested sourness puckered his expression. "I will grab something to eat while I'm here, but I'll take the train back to Pembrokeshire after that. I have barely seen my mother." "If you're sure the journey won't make you tired, what for? Traveling 12,000 miles to Alaska the next day?" He realized it was a stupid thing to say, but then had a better idea. "Talk to her about what she saw. See if you consider there is any truth in it. From what I've been told, she has been gravely misunderstood over the years." "No doubt, but she still has the capacity for fanciful flights. Never look at a logical explanation if a supernatural one can be grasped onto." Ebe chuckled. "She was right about a lot of things, though, son, from what they tell me. Her notes say she was sectioned because she believed her husband was a dangerous reptile, and that her son was an alien-human hybrid. Sounds crazy, but we both know it's not. Listen, is all I'm saying, and be careful. If I don't get you to Alaska safely, who knows what fate awaits us?" Or himself, if he failed to do his duty. "I'll drop you in the center before taking Harris here to be checked out." "Do you need checking out, Harris? I mean, if you're up to it, you could interrogate one pilot while I talk with the other?" Harris stared and mumbled something. Incoherent. "Guess we require a medical opinion then, huh? You're okay though, Ebe, yes? Not feeling odd at all?" "No more than usual," Ebe joked. He didn't understand the humor, but had heard it said before. People seemed to like it. Not knowing how to progress the conversation and having zero desire to do so, Ebe climbed into the rear passenger seat and stared at his chewed fingernails. Nathan helped the other agent into the car, and then with some effort, he squeezed behind the wheel. "I hate driving on your tiny little roads, but here goes." An unappetizing custard slice. The train connections back to Pembrokeshire were not scheduled for convenience. Commuting from the suburbs to the cities of Swansea, Cardiff, Newport, or even Bristol seemed not to be supported by public transport. Ebe had forgone his meal in the city to facilitate arriving in Milford Haven at a reasonable hour. Then he'd grab a taxi all the way to West Angle Bay and the West Angle Bay Hotel. It would be expensive, but the allowance he'd been given by HM government for services to world safety seemed to know no bounds. It was still cheaper than staying overnight in Swansea. As the railway took him out of the built-up industrial landscape and onto the sparsely populated coastal county, Ebe waited for an opportunity to eat the sausage roll and custard slice he'd bought from a bakery near the station. Both items would create crumbs, and the custard from the pastry sandwich could get everywhere. People watching him only made things worse. The pressure, the sick discomfort would be bad enough, but surety the attention made him less competent, meant he was starting to feel rather panicked. With an elderly lady staring at him unblinkingly, Ebe was convinced his hunger would consume him if he didn't respond to the pangs in his stomach soon. Hopefully, the large sausage roll would take the edge off. It's what he'd purchased as a sensible lunch. The slice was the result of temptation. In the queue, he had debated and talked himself in and out of the purchase 4 times before. The question, "And will there be anything else?" prompted him to blurt out. It could wait until at least the train had stopped, maybe between methods of transportation, although taxis waiting for the scheduled train probably wouldn't hang, around when no passengers were expected. And if he was going to delay until he got to the hotel, perhaps it could be a gift for his mum instead. Crumbs brushed from his face and t-shirt. Ebe settled with a smile. She'd like that. At Carmarthen, he hadn't realized he'd need to change trains. Successfully, he fought the temptation to scoff the pudding, not just to be nice to Karis, but because the anxiety of potentially missing the next train as he attempted to force half a pound of solid custard and 2 slabs of pastry down his throat by a specified time quelled his appetite. The later train wasn't really a train insomuch as it consisted of only one carriage. That was also the engine. The rattling and noisy wagon proved unconducive to eating or resting, and even gave the view from the windows a jarring edge. By the time he stepped off at Milford Haven's terminus and procured the only awaiting minicab, the 10-year-old Ford seemed like the lap of luxury. In silence they proceeded, Ebe regretting taking the seat in front, but not wanting to appear rude by sitting as far from the driver as possible. He was being impolite now, though. Apart from the question of where he wanted to go, he had deliberately avoided answering any of the barrage of questions from the driver. Was he here on holiday? Had he come far? What did he think about the Queen dying and the new king? And should Meghan Markle have come back to the country? Ebe scowled. Why did this man care about his views on anything? Correctly, he presumed he didn't. It was merely his way to open dialogue so he could tell him his views. He'd noticed most human conversations seemed to be like that. He didn't do that himself. Instead, he'd just launch into whatever was on his mind, oblivious to what anyone else was talking about previously. It might be a little blunt, but he didn't mean it that way. When he was enthusiastic about something, keeping it to himself was a difficult task. And at least it was honest. He paid the $64.40 with his card exactly, no tip, nor wishing the cabbie a safe journey. Outside the Edwardian mansion that was the hotel, a gulp of unfamiliar sentiments constricted his throat. As the cab turned around and drove away, Ebe stood still. His mother was in here. He didn't want to go to Alaska. But Molly was there, and he had no wish to be apart from her either. But he was here now, and he had a travel-weary custard tart to gift his mum. He bounded up the steps, pulled open the door, and gasped as he nearly collided with the object of his thoughts. "Mum!" he grinned. "Ebe, you're back." She threw her arms around him, obliterating the proffered pastry further. As they pulled apart, Ebe held it limply. "I got you this." Karis opened the bag and laughed. "Wow, Ebe, thank you. And it's..." Not even Christmas or my birthday or anything? Come on, let's go and find a plate. Ebe followed her into a kitchen the size of a regular home kitchen, but a bit larger, and fitted out in industrial stainless steel. It was spotlessly clean, and a 5-star hygiene rating placard hung proudly. Ebe loved it. Pulling open a drawer-fronted rack, Karis emptied the scrumpled bag onto a side plate and stared at it. Ebe raised his eyebrows, and they danced over his, flashing hazel eyes. They looked at one another and laughed. Do you mind if I don't eat it? Can I get you something instead? Are we allowed in here? Karis nodded. The staff left at 6 and said we could help ourselves to anything. Within reason, Ebe. Don't empty the whole freezer. Opting for catering-sized lasagna with instructions for microwave reheating brought back vivid childhood memories. Karis didn't know whether to laugh or cry as she remembered her mother's hapless kitchen attempts when she was a young girl in England all those decades ago. She'd missed her for 3 long years now. Her stay away from everyone and everything that was familiar to her had given a surrealness and taken her from those moments of, I'll just call my mum and tell her, which she imagined would be so painful. But now, here with her lovely son and all her questions over a lifetime of uncertainty answered, it was hard to miss her at all. Goodness knows what she'd endured before her. Medication had helped her diagnosis. But how much of that was simply distress at not being believed by anyone about what the humming noise signified? Karis knew. She always had. Her mother was far from mad. The meds had numbed her thinking, so she didn't care anymore. And Karis had experience with that. The far-fetched had a way of fading in the memory. Her psychology studies taught her how everything we recall is simply our recollection of the last time we thought about it. Without tangible, knowable things, to hook those memories onto, they struggle to take form. Even this morning's monsters were difficult to remember. After days, she would be suggestible to considering it had never happened. But the awareness of truth remained. It might not be backed up with strong testimony, but the knowledge never faded. She knew that too, from bitter personal experience. Ping, the lasagna announced itself. Cutting it in half, an extra big half for her greedy son, Karis slid. Each portion beside some ready-washed salad from a bag. Come on, we'll take these through and watch telly if you like. Rick and Morty? Karis chuckled. If you want. Ebe finished his food before Karis even had a chance to register if it was nice. It was, a far cry from the processed horror of her childhood. It was too much for her to finish, and she passed her still-laden plate to Ebe. You sure? His dancing eyebrows inquired, fork already digging into the cheese and meat. Once he'd scurfed salad leaves around the plate to scoop up the last of the bolognese and béarnaise sauce, he sat back with a satisfied, "Ah!" Eyes bulging, he burped. I feel a bit sick. You always do. I reckon you need to learn that you can stop eating before your stomach threatens to explode. Who knows? You might lose a bit of weight. She leaned over and patted his round belly. Ebe tapped his thigh a couple of times, wondering how to broach the subject Nathan had instructed him to tackle. It wasn't that he didn't have faith in her outlandish tale of creatures climbing out of the wall. Well, not just that. But if she convinced him it was true, that some kind of monster was hiding in another realm somewhere, released by the changing vibrations into our world. What, then? Mum? He forced himself to ask. What did happen this morning? Nathan arrived at the hospital and checked Harris into the reception of accident and emergency. It's a 4-hour wait at the moment, I'm afraid. She didn't look afraid. Perhaps she should be, Nathan considered, but he recognized his gun and badge wouldn't get him very far, really. It should. Whatever Ebe was required to do in Alaska, these people would be immensely grateful for if they understood. He was sure every one of them would let him jump the queue and probably give them a standing ovation the while, those who could stand anyway. watching an old man puke into a bag and a young girl, cheeks streaked with tears, a blood-soaked tea towel covering her hand, which she held aloft, he had to concede that perhaps Harris's mild confusion wasn't so urgent. Ebe would be eating and resting by now. That was good. They wouldn't be going anywhere today, and by tomorrow, hopefully, they'd have a lot more answers to take with them. Mum, what's wrong? He'd seen the mood 100 times throughout his childhood, and it had never been good. Marco had always described it as catatonic, and it usually indicated that she'd been pushed too far. Clues had been missed that might have brought her round sooner, and Marco always felt terribly guilty. Old Marco, that is. When he changed, he didn't care. Oddly, that seemed to work better. Ebe had cared, but never really showed it. He'd cuddle her, and that helped. And he never had taken it personally, and that had helped too. What troubled him now was how it often used to end, with her cutting herself. If that's what she needed to feel better, then he didn't object. It was her body to harm, her arms to scar. He hated seeing the evidence that she was hurting, though. He asked again, careful to keep the tone blame-free and calm. "Mom, is everything okay?" Her laughter peeled around the room as Ebe pulled his chin down, trying to work out what was funny. "I was just trying to see the faces again. And then I imagined what you must be thinking. Sorry, that's not funny at all. It must have been hard for you growing up worrying about me all the time." "Sorry," she said again. Ebe grinned. "I wasn't worried. I cared, that's all. I knew you'd be okay. You're my mum." He wrapped his big arms around her, then pulled away to regard her. "What do you mean you were trying to see the faces again? Is that a good idea?" "Depends. I would rather know what I'm dealing with. And you asked me about this morning, so I thought I'd show you." Her face paled. "You don't suppose they're hiding in every wall, do you? I mean, I've never seen them before. I assumed I stumbled across a portal or something." "I don't know, Mum. You're the one who's seen them." He hoped she didn't object to his lack of belief. "I think we're all right. I've been staring at that one for a while, and we haven't been eaten." "What one?" "There." Karis pointed to nothing at a particular place on the wall. "What? I can't see anything." She frowned. "Look, there are the eyes. Mouth, nose. See?" Ebe turned his head one way, then tilted it the other. Squinting, eventually he sighed and shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mum." Karis pushed herself up from the couch and strode to the wall. "Here!" She circled a patch. Ebe saw the dirty mark and another next to it when she pointed to that too, and more below, and loads of others she didn't show. Why was she picking? These in particular? "Oh, come on, Ebe. Don't be annoying," she scowled. Her face relaxed. "Of course." It was his Asperger's. He'd never seen faces on the charts, and photos of different expressions left him confused. Happy, angry, or sad were countenances he was confident to identify, but he regularly got them wrong. The intricacies of depictions of embarrassed or shy or smug or any number of other emotions were branded as one of the three bases. Karis admired it as a way to live. What did it mean now? Was Ebe at risk of being devoured by monsters climbing out of the wall without ever seeing them and having a chance to escape? The truth of what she had seen withered. It all seemed so silly. It couldn't be true, really. She took her seat back next to Ebe. "Film?" He nodded. It would take forever to choose something. Every suggestion would need thorough research. Reviews read and compared, movie length, director, cinematography, and many criteria would be considered before they would actually start watching something. Karis didn't mind. She was just thrilled to be with her son. "Carl Harris?" An Indian doctor called out from a door along the waiting room. All the doors had numbers on, and this one had number 4 displayed in a large blue lettering, "Against Wood Effect." "Come on, Harris. That's you." Nathan pulled his subordinate up to his feet and guided him to the room they were being called into. "Carl Harris?" the doctor asked as they approached. Nathan fought the urge to be sarcastic. "No, I just thought Carl Harris was a colloquial term for next in this part of the world." He nodded and guided Carl through the doorway. 2 seats, one beside a desk, the other against the wall, and a trolley bed filled the room. The doctor took the desk chair and guided Carl to the other. That left Nathan either perching on the bed, which seemed wrong as he wasn't the one who was unwell, or standing. He stood and loomed over them from his 6'4" elevation. "What seems to be the trouble?" the Indian said with a head wobble, his mustache twitching over his top lip. Carl smiled and shrugged. Peering up at his boss, his eyes implored him for help. He was in the cockpit of our private aircraft. It crashed whilst taxiing on the runway, and my colleague here, the pilot and the co-pilot, were all unconscious. The paramedics said they all needed checking out. It sounded urgent, like medical intervention might prevent brain damage, but we've been waiting in that room for over 3 hours. The predicted wait time was 4 hours, the doctor rolled his eyes, sharing their disgust in the service, and reminding him they were lucky to be seen sooner. Turning back to Harris, he asked, "How long was he unconscious for?" "A few minutes, I suppose. He's been pretty confused since as well. He's not normally this much of a clodhopper." The doctor nodded solemnly. "I expect the doctor will arrange a scan, make sure nothing serious is going on. It's most likely a concussion. I would have preferred him to be wearing a collar, but as he's already walked in here, a spinal fracture is unlikely." "Doctor? I thought you were the doctor." "I'm the triage nurse. If you'd like to go back to the waiting room, a doctor will call you back in when they're ready." Nathan sighed. "How long?" The nurse shrugged. "As long as it takes. How long is a piece of string?" Quelling his anger, Nathan asked after the others. "The pilots? Have they been seen?" "Like I say, they were brought in by ambulance." "I don't know. You'll have to ask at reception." "You can't check for me? On your computer there?" The nurse pursed his lips. "I'll look quickly. There are a lot of people waiting." "1 minute. Just let me know if they're okay." He was far more concerned with what they might have said. The Indian swiveled his chair to face the computer, tapped a hidden password into an encoded box, but Nathan spotted and memorized the sequence automatically. "Name? Sorry, friend, I don't know their names." "Why don't you search for anyone brought here from Swansea Airport?" The man snorted. "I need a name. I can't search without one." Nathan had had enough. Badge yanked from his pocket, his holstered gun visible for just a second. "I'm not joking around, son. I need to speak to them on a matter of international importance. Be part of the solution. Don't be a part of the problem, okay? Either find where the heck they are, or I'm going to look for them myself." "You can't do that," Nathan laughed. "You gonna stop me, son?" "I'll call the police." "I am the goddamn police. I haven't flown halfway around the world to waste time. Tell me what I want to know now, or things are gonna get bad for you, my friend. And the way you're pissing me off, I'll take great pleasure in showing you." "We have a 0 tolerance for abusive or threatening language or behavior in this hospital." Nathan stepped forward. He was brave, he'd give him that. "I have a 0 tolerance for little a-holes who get in my way." He resisted physically, moving the man, and instead treated him to a perfect Texan smile. "You look after my friend here. I'm fixin' to find the others." Ignoring objections, Nathan pulled open a second door at the back of the triage room and entered the sanctum of those who had passed triage, had seen a doctor, and who were now waiting for scans or x-rays or to be admitted to a ward. People stared as he scoured the side rooms for their familiar faces, but no one challenged him. Glimpsing the pilot through a gap in the curtain, he strode over, ready to flash his badge to gain access. He didn't need to. The aviator was sitting alone on a trolley bed. Nathan smiled. "You okay?" Pleased when he got a response. It meant the confusion was fading. He stepped closer. "What happened?" The pilot blew through his lips and shook his head. I was going to ask you the same thing. You being in the FBI, I thought it must be a scene from the X-Files. That was some weird goings-on, that's for sure. Nathan's hunch seemed to be accurate, but to be sure, he didn't want to put words in the man's mouth, so he waited patiently for him to elaborate. Wearing civilian clothes, there was no need to dress up for a private flight on a Saturday. Lawrence shook his head. His jogging bottoms and dirty t-shirt were probably a surprise to them, but what were they going to do? Refuse him to let them fly? He couldn't give a shit if they did. They were lucky he was flying at all. Keeping his hours up had been the only thing to beat through his depression since Susan had left him. That, and the strong dose of antidepressants he was supposed to be taking. They'd worked. He'd gone from feeling like he was spiraling really close to the ground, any dip ready to obliterate him, to elevated at a normal-ish height. He still felt shit, but sensed he had a bit of wriggle room left between his mood and rock bottom. The lift in spirit had prompted him to stop the tablets. The heart palpitations and cramps he was suffering had been listed as possible side effects, and when the concern outgrew the benefit, he decided they'd done their job and he'd take it from here. Flying when he could, he knew was vital. Whilst there had been times he'd been seriously tempted to push the stick forward and plow his nose into the ground. Somewhere in the back of his head, he knew his career would be his savior in the end. Susan didn't deserve the satisfaction. Noon was that important to another person. She couldn't be, or she wouldn't have left when business dropped to almost bust during the pandemic. Someone to fly with him in good weather and storms was what he needed. If he found somebody, he'd parade them in front of his soon-to-be ex-wife. She did deserve that. A smile reached his lips, thinking how he thought in aviation metaphors. He had a long way to go, but he knew he was on the up. There I go again. He even managed to chuckle. Agreeing to fly had been hasty, but it was a paid job. It was costing them a fortune. Not quite enough to get him smartly dressed. Slotting in between scheduled skydives had been awkward, because with over 100 people booked to complete tandem jumps, as soon as the weather was clear, they wanted to get into the sky where they would be in the way of him taking off for half an hour. He was relieved there were clouds around because it gave some opportunity where the small jump plane was grounded due to it not being clear jumping conditions, but was perfectly safe to take off. Lawrence looked at his watch and nodded at the sight of a vehicle approaching. Promptly, a big black Jeep pulled onto the tarmac, out of which alighted a man in a suit who then proceeded to open the rear door. Another dark-suited guy climbed out, putting the pilot in mind of an adult in a child's funfair ride. He was so enormous. The car was large, too, so his size was even more impressive considering the scale. He looked down at his own attire and felt a pang of guilt. Then, the person the aircraft had been chartered to accommodate, Lawrence assumed, climbed out, blinking awkwardly in the morning sunlight as though it was a rare sight for him. Broad in build, chubby but strong-looking, the man had a disproportionately large cranium with huge dark eyes. If it was Halloween, he wouldn't need a mask, Lawrence thought unkindly. He couldn't appear more like an extraterrestrial if they'd stuck him in a bike basket and thrown a towel over him. So that's what his services were being called for. E.T. was going home. It wasn't the first time he'd transported unusual passengers. He'd already signed papers regarding international official secrets, as had his co-pilot Ian, who was yet to emerge from the toilet. The results of a relaxing Friday night, presumably. Between his suicidal ideation and his colleague's hangover, were they even safe to fly? The smaller-suited man introduced himself as Agent Harris. "The big guy is my boss, Nathan Dale. Don't piss him off. He gets angry real quick." Lawrence had no intention of it. "And our burden is a scientist and mathematical genius by the name of Ebe Ellis." Lawrence nodded. Yeah, whatever. He didn't seem like a scientist. He didn't look like a genius either, but it made no difference. To him, who he took. Ian finally showed his face from the terminal building, looking bright and happy. Perhaps he'd misjudged him. They took their seats in the aircraft. The fastened seat belts sign illuminated for a minute before Lawrence steered towards the short runway. Now wasn't the time to be making images from the clouds, but the ones in front of him were looming large. "Ian, look at that!" Ian appeared to stare through the cockpit window before looking back at him in confusion. "What?" "Oh, it's nothing, really. Don't you think the clouds look like giant faces, that's all? See, eyes, nose, big gaping mouth." "Ha ha, oh yeah, don't fly into that, it might eat us," Ian chortled. Lawrence was pleased his observation was being appreciated, and he smiled to himself as the craft reached the beginning of the airstrip. As he turned to line up with the strip of ratty concrete that Swansea Airport called the runway, he paused. Lost in concentration, he wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Surely the clouds weren't that mesmerizing. The face had been joined by another. With a rueful shake of his head, he slowly pushed the stick forward and began a slow acceleration, ready for takeoff. Head shaking in rapid jerks, he tried to free himself from the vision. 3, 4 faces in the clouds now had bodies forming. A glance at Ian, and he was as calm as ever. His imagination was vividly creating a horrific scene in front of him. Another side effect of his antidepressants, or of coming off them before he was ready. The faces, no longer contained within the clouds, flew towards the plane. Larger and larger, faces and big gray limbs leering towards him. "They're just clouds, only clouds," he repeated the mantra, quick glances to Ian confirming they weren't real. Lawrence trembled. The order for his co-pilot to take over perched on his lips. He closed his eyes for just a second to dispel the vision back to his imagination. Crash! Glass cracked and shattered, spilling into them. "Bloody hell!" cried Ian, and Agent Harris struggled to enter the cockpit to ask what was wrong before unleashing his own expletives. After shielding himself from the flying glass, which, at 70 miles per hour, had flown inside and hit them, he looked at Lawrence, who was gripping the stick in white knuckles and staring unblinkingly through where the windshield had been. Unsafe to take off now, he veered away from what, despite logic screaming at him, wasn't real, had broken through the wall of imagination and smashed into his plane. He didn't understand, but that didn't matter. He had to get safe. If not for himself, then out of a sense of duty for his passengers. It was too late to slow the craft using just the brakes, so he made a quick decision to increase friction on the tires by steering onto the grass and grazing the hedgerow that shielded the unsightly airport from the view of Gower Peninsula walkers, as they ascended the hills and coastal cliffs of Britain's first officially designated site of scientific interest. A controlled crash, he'd call it. He hoped the Civil Aviation Authority would see it the same way. With a scream, he couldn't believe what he saw as the faces in the clouds moved with the craft. How could they move like that? There was no wind to explain it, and they looked so much like real sentient faces that he feared he must be going crazy. They flew towards the cockpit, the open space with no protection. Protection from what? They're only clouds, Lawrence remembered thinking, before a crippling nausea made consciousness desert him. The ambulance arriving and people asking him questions survived in his memory as a kind of dream. His only fully conscious consideration was recognizing the big FBI agent as he peeped in at him from round a curtain. After telling him what had happened, he'd expected a knowing smile. "You're a screwball," etched on his face. But the look the big man gave his wasn't that at all. "That's what I thought you were going to say. Not in the clouds, perhaps, but faces. Becoming real and attacking you. It's the second time I've heard the same thing today." Nathan leaned in. "Of course, I needn't remind you of what you signed." "Don't piss him off." The words etched on his mind. And funnily enough, recounting the incident wasn't something he was keen to do. Even without the threat. Nathan was keen to get a report from the other pilot as soon as he could. If this was becoming a risk, he needed as much information as possible. As they'd come in at the same time, it seemed logical he might be nearby. But he couldn't spot him. As he wandered around in the hope of coming across him, a nurse in a dark blue overalls approached him. "Are you looking for something?" she asked, in a tone that suggested he shouldn't be. Nathan revealed his badge and put a finger to his lips. His desire for quiet wasn't to surprise a suspect. He just wanted her to shut up before he lost. His temper. Did he look like whatever his reasons they wouldn't be important? Why did he always have to explain himself to everybody? He saved their pitiful lives so many times he'd lost count, and he couldn't even tell them. Resigned to his fate, he nodded when the vaguely familiar, lacerated face of the other pilot emerged from a treatment room. "A word, if I may." He widened his eyes. "I'm sorry. My patient isn't in a position to answer any questions at the moment." Nathan forgave them their interference because at least they had recognized his authority without him having to demonstrate it. He ignored them and stared the pilot into submission. "It's fine, honestly." Ian smiled and allowed himself to be escorted to a quiet corner of the room. "I just need to quickly listen to your version of what happened, that's all. You understand?" "Of course. I don't know," is the quick answer. Lawrence didn't look right even before the bird hit the windshield. "Bird? What was it, an eagle?" "Well, I didn't see it. But we hit something. We steered to safety, but then I felt terribly sick. Fumes, I expect, or the sudden rush of air, or maybe some of the glass hit me in just the right place. But anyway, I was knocked unconscious. I only came around fully a few minutes ago." "You didn't see anything unusual?" Ian shrugged. "The whole thing is pretty unusual. Nothing like it has ever happened to me before, I can tell you that much." "You didn't see any faces in the clouds?" Seeing the shock on Ian's face, Nathan regretted the question. "Lawrence was pointing out things, yes. Just funny faces, you know. Just faces made of cloud shapes like you see every day. Not unusual. Why?" "Oh, no reason. Just something the other pilot told me. Sounded crazy, just wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, but if you saw nothing..." Lawrence had been decidedly crazy since Susan left him. He hadn't seen much of him, only that people were worried about him. Not wanting to add to his troubles, he said no more. Legs up on the trolley, bed, he closed his eyes, then opened them again to give the impression he needed rest, and raised his hand in a feeble wave as the big man left him alone again.